Hello, I'm Alice Hale, and welcome to Purl Grey. You know that my name is Alice Hale because I've just said it, but who am I? What is my story? Why am I doing this? What led me to creating a YouTube channel roughly about knitting? The first thing to know about me is that I am from New Hampshire. I was born there. My parents are both from there. My grandparents are from the New England area. I'm very much a New England person. It's like in my blood, in the sort of, figurative and literal sense, I guess. The thing about New Hampshire that I took for granted really long after even I moved to New York, is that it really is a very special place with these wonderful communities that are very sort of artistic and kind of do-it-yourself and handmade and have all these wonderful sensibilities. Because you know how when you grow up with something, a certain mindset or a certain, resources or anything like that, you really don't quite understand that they're not normal until you have been somewhere else where they aren't. Something that I didn't really appreciate at the time, along with many other things, is that New Hampshire is a very rich knitting community, and mostly just sort of out of necessity of history. It's very much out in the country. The nearest city is Boston, but even of the cities in the state, even our largest one is like laughable compared to most cities elsewhere in the country and in other states. So most people live in very small towns and in a relatively rural environment. Now, New Hampshire used to be more agricultural than it is. I feel like I'm just giving you a New Hampshire history lesson. I swear to God I'm not. When I first moved to New York for school, a lot of my classmates, when I introduced myself and told them where I was from, one of the first questions was often like, oh, do you live on a farm? Which I don't, for the record. I did not grow up on a farm. New Hampshire really is more sort of woodsy than Vermont, for example. Vermont has a lot more agriculture, and there's like a lot of dairy farms and things like that. So New Hampshire isn't so much that. There's still an agricultural legacy. People have livestock and there are farms around, but that isn't like the dominant sort of feature of the economy or the landscape. It's more about sort of like being in the woods in this pretty cold state. Our winters can get pretty rough, and people do have animals. When I was in elementary school, my best friend's family had sheep and chickens and ducks and things, and we went on a field trip in, I think, preschool or kindergarten, to their little farm, and we got to interact with animals. So I was around a lot of that, and I sort of had those connections that were made for me of like, well, this is how we get eggs, and like this is how we get wool, and those sort of things from a very early age. The same friend's family, they actually, in I want to say second or third grade, her mother came in and gave a whole presentation and demonstration to our class of the whole process of wool turning into yarn. And so we actually had, even after she left behind, these baskets full of fleece, washed and stuff, because you're not going to just like give elementary schoolers just like dirty unwashed fleece. She left them there with the carding brushes. And I remember I would be fascinated. I would just spend my sort of the free times, or not recess, but like the very sort of free play or work time. I would card this wool. I found it so soothing and fascinating, and the idea that like, oh yeah, this turns into yarn, and that turns into a sweater, and so I had those connections and that frame of reference drawn from a very young age. Which now I'm very grateful for, and I realize that most people don't have. My great aunt had sheep and probably also chickens. It was a little farm called Mayfair Farm that, I don't know all the family history, but it's been in our family for at least a couple generations. Her little house was all full of sheep things. And yeah, like, you know, there's a spinning wheel in the corner in the living room right by the fireplace. And the idea that this was just something that was around you, that was just something that people did, was very much a part of my childhood and my understanding of knitting. It was like, okay, you're 8, you can handle this now, here's how to do the knit stitch. I learned to knit when I was 8 years old. On my 8th birthday, my grandmother gave me a little basket with 3 balls of yarn, just Lion brand, not something it wasn't anything very fancy or expensive, and a pair of, I think, size 10 needles. And that night she like cast on for me and she showed me how to do the knit stitch. And my grandmother has always knit, you know, my entire memory of her, probably most of her life. She was a very utilitarian knitter. She would knit sweaters for my grandfather, just, you know, everyday sweaters, just very simple, you know. I think she used an Elizabeth Zimmerman pattern. It's kind of a top down, and she would just keep making him these sweaters because he would keep like wearing through them or whatever. And she made zillions of socks. She went through this whole phase of just like always making socks after socks after socks. She would always be knitting anytime that we were over there, you know, after dinner in the evenings. She would take out her knitting while we were watching TV or anything like that, or just talking. And we would get socks year after year for Christmas, which is so special because, you know, she hand knit them and they're beautiful. I know that my mother was a knitter, not actively while I was growing up, which is unfortunate. I wish that she had done more knitting, but I guess she just didn't have time. But because, well, we had a lot of yarn often just sort of in boxes kind of tucked away in the storage. But I would sometimes find some unfinished patterns, like projects that she'd started. And I guess, you know, she knitted certainly up through her 20s. I know that she knitted me a few things when I was a baby, because I found them sort of recently, you know, these little mittens or a little sweater. But she knitted, I think, a lot in college and in her 20s and probably early 30s, because like my father has a sweater that she knitted him like when they were first married. So he's had that sweater for like 25 years now. And she has a sweater I know that she knitted probably in her 20s. And so, you know, I grew up around this idea of like that legacy of knitting, that you have these things that someone made for you by hand, and, you know, it's nice wool, and you keep it, and you know, take care of it, and you hold on to it for years and years and years. That it isn't this disposable thing, that it isn't just sort of a gimmick, that it isn't, yeah, that it really is this sense of giving. And I also had the luxury of the resource of, you know, my mother is a knitter, even if she wasn't really actively knitting things at that point. But when I was first learning, you know, I would do a row, and then I would run and I would find wherever she was, whether she was like doing laundry or, you know, doing dishes or wherever she was around the house, and I would find her and I'd be like, can you take a look at it? Did I make any mistakes? And she would go through and she'd be like, okay, well this here, let me fix it. And she would fix it for me, and then she would give it back to me. And then I would keep going another row, and then I would run and find her wherever she was, whether she was like working at her desk or something in the like home office, and or whatever it was that she was doing. I'd be like, Mom, can you take a look at it? And then eventually, you know, she's like, nope, you're okay. Nope, you're fine. And I think that's something that is hard for a lot of beginner knitters, because they don't have someone to just like check it over and be like, no, you're all set. You can keep going, and you're not going to be like continuing to make a mistake that's going to get worse. There was a huge emphasis put on, you know, the joy and the importance of knitting, but also on the flip side of that, it was so normal that it was not something that you necessarily had to seek out or pursue, or sort of, it wasn't anything exceptional. It was just sort of something that you did. Just something that you did, you know, in your free time, and, you know, you had fun with it, but it wasn't something to necessarily make a big deal of. So I didn't really have the motivation or the impetus or the need to seek out kind of a broader knitting community, because I always had this sense of like, well, yeah, just kind of everyone sort of knits, and it's just a thing that people do. Whereas I think a lot of people who learn to knit in areas and or in families or whatever, where no one else really knits, or there are very few people, they have this drive to be like, okay, well, where are other people talking about this? Where are people who I can share this amazing thing with? So I learned to knit in elementary school, and I did all sorts of little things, you know, certainly like scarves and little, I did a lot of scarves, as most people do. You know, just little things that were square or rectangular. I did learn to knit in the round pretty early. I want to say I was maybe 10 or 11 when I made my first hat. It was also my first project that was from a pattern. It wasn't just me fooling around with some yarn and being like, look, I made an oddly shaped thing. It was a very simple hat, but it taught me how to knit in the round, and it conveyed more of a sense of sort of that, the formality of, you know, going to a yarn store, because I did this with my mother. She brought me to a yarn store. We were on vacation, and we picked out a pattern together that was something that I wanted to do, and then we went, you know, and found just the right yarn that would work with it really well. And that sense of like, okay, having sort of this contained project of like, this is the yarn that I'm going to use to make this, and then I'm going to do it according to what the pattern says. And that was a cool experience, but honestly, I didn't use that many patterns for a long time. I would occasionally. I remember I made a pair of baby booties when I was maybe in middle school that was from a pattern. And that was, I think, like, I was figuring out how to pick up stitches, just like kind of on the fly. I did get sort of bitten in middle school by, there was a huge sort of explosion of a trend of those hat looms that are sort of like the little, like I-cord little, like spool knitting thing, but really on a larger scale. So you could make hats, but they were just with that little round of pegs that you're like passing yarn over each one. And it were a good couple years when that just like took over my sort of crafting consciousness. In 8th grade, a friend and I actually, we did a booth at a local craft fair, and we sold a bunch of those hats that were on the little hat looms with the pegs, because we were raising money to pay for the school trip that we were going on to Washington, D.C. in 8th grade. You know, because each kid had to pay a certain amount to go on the trip to cover all the costs. And so that was how we like fundraised for our own Washington trip. And that was a lot of fun. I remember there was a lot of satisfaction, even though, you know, they were not, in retrospect, great hats. Like, they were very simple, they were kind of boring. We had fun with the colors and the yarns and stuff. I'm sure it was just like cheap acrylic yarn, whatever we had on hand. But the sense of satisfaction of someone in, you know, it's a small community, and this was a craft fair in my own hometown, someone coming up, seeing all the things that I had made, and saying, yeah, I like that. I want to buy that from you. There was also a Christmas when I made everyone in my extended family one of those hats. I got very obsessed. But that, you know, waned pretty quickly because there was only so much that you can do with that. You can basically make hats or like a tube scarf. So I started going back to knitting, and I started experimenting more with my knitting. I taught myself how to do cables from a book. Which was a kind of a huge light bulb moment, because up until then I'd felt a little bit like if I wanted to learn something new, I had to like ask someone who already knew to show me how to do it. This was a little early for sort of YouTube tutorials being the go-to way to learn something, which it's so great now to be able to just like watch a video of someone doing something. But it was a little early for that. And I mean, it was probably out there, but I wasn't sort of programmed to look for that there. I sort of had a moment of like, well, here's a like knitting how-to book that I had, and it was like, oh, there's a section in here about how to do cables. I bet I could figure that out. And I think it was at another craft fair. This was in high school. It was at a craft fair where I was selling some of my knitted things. You're sitting there for several hours. And so I just, during the course of that day, I taught myself how to do cables out of the book. So it was exciting because I was like, oh yeah, I can build on my skills and just kind of decide to, rather than sort of wait until someone sort of amorphous concept of like someone else tells me that I'm ready. I started playing around a little more with like, oh, okay, well if I know how to increase and decrease, I can just kind of do stuff. And I started making a lot of hats. knitted hats now instead of on the hat loom. So I just started playing around with colors and textures and stitch patterns, and then with cables. And then I taught myself how to do stranded color work just from watching a fellow student of mine in high school who's a couple years older than me. We were on this long field trip in a car, and she was knitting a colorwork sweater, and she was working on the sleeves, and she had, a few inches done, and she was going with the, two hands of one color in each hand. I was like, kind of like just watching her. I think I probably asked what she was doing, like what she was making and all that, but I just was like, I watched her for long enough and was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That seems pretty straightforward. I bet I could do that. So I started figuring out like stranded color work in high school, messing around with it. Again, I'd made enough hats just on my own, I'd done it enough that I could just kind of improvise. Like I knew about how many stitches I needed to cast on, and like if I needed to be a multiple of something to do a pattern then. So I just started like doing some colorwork hats and like cabled hats and stuff like that, and it was a really good sort of like training ground for just like being able to go through a lot of projects and a lot of different sorts of patterns and be like, okay, well that didn't work out so well, but it wasn't some huge loss because it wasn't as though I like invested all of this money in yarn and then in buying a pattern and then like kind of just like following a pattern, being like, okay, this is what it's telling me to do. It was just very trial and error. I mean, most of the yarn I was using was probably either cheap acrylic or it was stuff that I had inherited from my grandmother's collection. Her stash, she would often like offload just like a bag of just like, well, please just take these like random, single skeins that I don't have room for or were left over from something or whatever it might be. So I didn't spend a lot of money on yarn, which was another reason that craft fairs were easy, because I had basically no overhead and I would just be like, sure, I'll do that and I'll save myself a few things, and then it was mostly fun. Just again, a little hit of that, like that sense of, like someone likes what I made. I made a thing and someone liked it enough to then buy it. I just started playing around with, I remember, I guess, freshman year of high school, when the movie The Golden Compass came out, and I just read the book and I was really excited for the movie. And when I saw the movie, there's an adorable little hat that Lyra is wearing, and it has a little peak at the top, and I just was looking at it and it's this little rolled back brim. I was like, yeah, I think I could do that. Yeah, if you just, yeah. And so I went home like that night after going to the movie theater, and I just like I found some yarn that I was like, okay, that seems like about the right color and thickness. Again, I had a lot of yarn that I had just sort of amassed. I was like, okay, and I probably did it in just like a couple days. And I just kind of figured it out. I was like, well, if I just kind of increase up there, yeah, okay. And so I still have that. And it turned out really well. And that sort of sense of, oh, I can see something or like visualize something and then decide that I want to make this thing that then looks like it in real life, and I can decide that, was really freeing and really empowering. Once I hit college, knitting, it took a backseat because, when you're moving back and forth to college, especially in New York, where you can't just like, it's harder to just like load up the family car and just like drive right into college. I couldn't really keep yarn around. I didn't have like a huge supply of, I couldn't bring my stash with me. I would sometimes have a project or two or something that I would do, like, but it was hard because you need like a lot of needle. There's a lot of stuff involved with knitting, and it's obnoxious to transport it back and forth from school to home. I would kind of go on knitting binges when I would get home on vacations. I remember there was one like winter break where I think I made over a dozen hats in like 2 weeks. It was just like I just flew through. I didn't bother to try to like kind of progress or explore further because it just became sort of something that I was able to do in these like short bursts, and that it was just sort of a release, and it wasn't something that I wanted to be like, okay, I'm gonna knuckle down and like learn all the new techniques I need for this pattern, or even being organized enough to be like, okay, I have like a sweater quantities of yarn, I'm gonna do this. There was one time that I'm a little embarrassed about. It must have been in like late middle school or early high school. Probably early high school. My mother and grandmother actually kind of like took me in hand and were like, okay, we're going to guide you through making your first sweater. I was very excited. And it was just like the simple, I think Elizabeth Zimmerman top-down no-sew pattern that my grandmother always used. She refers to it as the idiot sweater. It might be the term that Elizabeth Zimmerman also uses. I have not read any Elizabeth Zimmerman yet. I plan to. That is on the list. I will confirm that when I actually read Elizabeth Zimmerman. They got me the pattern. We went through did measurements. We like highlighted all the little, you know, the things for my measurements, sizes, and we went to, I mean, it wasn't anywhere fancy. I think it was probably just Michael's or somewhere. I think it was Michael's. We just bought a lot of Lion brand woolies. Got it started. I got through the yoke. It was exciting because it was like, oh my god, it's looking like a real sweater. And I got into the body, and I probably got halfway to 2/3 of the way through the body of it, and I never got any farther. It is sitting in a bag on the top shelf of my closet back home. I never finished my first sweater, which I still feel bad about, because it would have been a good like benchmark to have at that point, you know, in like my knitting life. But I didn't. I think I got bored because it was just a lot of knitting, just endless, you know. It was the body of a sweater, so it's big, but it's just stockinette forever. And I think I just was like, well, I want to do this shiny new project, and that shiny new project, and I just never got back to it. But next time I'm going home, I'm definitely gonna get it. I'm sure I'm a different size at this point because that was like 10 years ago. But I probably like pull it out, and I'll use that for something else. We even got like a nice, I can't remember the brand, but it was like a nice circular needle, and like, you know, it was kind of a big deal, and it was very special, but then I didn't finish it, which I still feel bad about. Actually, what I'm wearing is my first ever completed garment. And the embarrassing thing is that this happened maybe a month and a half ago. I finally finished an actual knitted garment as opposed to like a hat or mittens or a scarf, or I've done like a baby blanket, but I tended to be, especially in like high school and college, where as I said, college I wasn't doing much knitting at all. I was just sort of going for like quick projects that were simple, that were more just like let's try out a new skill, or like I have this idea for like something I want to put on a hat. So I have a zillion hats. I have so many hats that I have knitted. I have an Etsy store that I set up like during college, mostly because I was like, I have a bin full of hats. What do I do with them? And I didn't have like the time or flexibility to be like going to craft fairs, because usually they take place in the fall or like before Christmas and stuff, you know, early December or something, which is when I was at school, so I wasn't at home for those sort of things. So I started an Etsy. So I do have that up there. There are a few things up there. I've been bad at updating it. I really should, because I have way too many hats and things. I hadn't buckled down and gotten organized enough to knit a garment until this, which I can talk about more in another video, but the sense of satisfaction and the sense of sort of control over the idea that like, oh, I made a thing that I can wear in my life that isn't just, you know, a hat that I stick on when it gets cold. The idea that it's like, oh, this is an everyday thing that I can wear. I've worn it to work, which was like, you know, it was such a cool feeling of like, oh, I made this and I like it and it fits me, because I like messed with the pattern to, you know, anyway, this concept of like, you can know your own body and you can know your own measurements and how you knit and all of the other factors, and you can make those decisions for yourself. You don't have to sort of be a slave to the relatively arbitrary sizing of the fashion industry in order to clothe yourself in a way that you will be most comfortable and flattered and all of that. I have felt much more powerful in my knitting. I have felt like, okay, this is something that not only am I like legit at, because now I've made a garment, so like I'm a real knitter, right? But also that can bring me so much more even than it was before. Because before it was sort of like, well, this is an outlet, and this is something that I do just like kind of for fun, like to decompress, and maybe occasionally I'll like go to a craft fair and make a few bucks. It's been this past year, in the past few months, that I've really revived my interest and my engagement with knitting, because I read Clara Parks's Knitlandia, which is a wonderful book. I highly recommend, and I talked a bit more about it in the salutations, the very first episode. So you can hear a little more about my experience with that book there. But basically that has set off a whole chain reaction of me both taking a step back and looking at my knitting, and both what I'm making and what I use to make it, you know, the kind of yarn that I'm using and everything. And I can talk a bit more about that in a later episode. But also the role that I want the knitting community to play in my life. So this YouTube channel is a part of that. It's sort of a way to document that, both for myself, also to hold myself accountable to actually getting out there and doing these things, and a way to share that with other people who might sort of be in that nether region of being a knitter, but not feeling like you're like a real knitter, or not feeling like you have an entry point into the knitting world. Because that's how I felt for a very long time. It was like I knew it was out there, I knew that there were people doing amazing things, and I kind of felt like I didn't belong in a weird way. You know what? I'm here, I'm gonna try to make a go of it, and I'm gonna be here for anyone else who wants to kind of take some of those next steps. To be like, this is a thing I love, and I want to really experience it and feel engaged with this wider community. So I really wanted to take a step back for myself and say, you know what? You are a knitter. You are a real knitter. It sounds so awkward. The other thing about growing up in a community where knitting is very common and it's, you know, well emphasized, is that you start to feel like, oh, well, everyone knits, so it's not special that I knit. And so many people knit so well that you feel like, well, I'm not a really good knitter. Like, I'm not a real knitter. My point here, and I'm probably gonna keep saying this a lot, is that if you knit, you are a knitter. I don't care if you don't know how to do color work. I don't care if, you know, you've never knit a garment. You know, I think that there are a lot of things about places like Ravelry or even certain like blogs and things that can sometimes feel like, oh, well, but I haven't done that amazing thing that that person's showing, so clearly I'm not as much of a knitter as they are. No. Because you know what? That person was once exactly where you are, and knitting really, it's said a lot, but it's totally true. It's 2 stitches, knit and purl, and once you can do that, yeah, there are a lot of other techniques and skills, but everything is building on that. And so really, you're probably not very far away from knitting that amazing thing that that person posted. It's gorgeous. And you know what? You could do it too. You're just like, maybe you're working on different size needles usually. Maybe you're not used to that type of a fiber. Maybe you haven't done much lace. I had not done any lace. I literally like didn't know how to do a yarn over because I never sat down and been like, okay, what is the actual thing? Oh, that's so straightforward. Until a few months ago. I knit my first lace project in May. And right now it is September. But you know what? I'm a knitter. You are too, or you soon will be. If you're watching this and you don't know how to knit yet, it's easy. There are lots of YouTube tutorials out there that will show you how to do that. I'm not gonna do that here, because again, I think that there are a lot of other people who have already done that very well. This channel is to really just try to bring all these things together, because I feel like sometimes it can feel intimidating to sort of be like, I want to learn more about this world, and I want to get out there and do things, but I'm not really sure where to start. And that's how I felt for a very long time. Even like going into yarn shops and stuff, I was feeling like I don't deserve this beautiful fiber, or I can't afford much of it, so I shouldn't even be in here because like I'm just taking up space in their business. We can talk about yarn shops another thing, but basically, no. The thing about the knitting world is that you're never just taking up space, you know? It's all about learning, and it's all about sharing, and it's all about making. Maybe you can't afford, you know, a sweater's quantity of Malabrigo at the point that you are in your life. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't, you know, explore your local yarn shops and meet other knitters and learn new techniques, because then maybe someday when you can't afford something really fancy, or you want to do a smaller project with a smaller amount of it, or whatever it is, then you're totally ready, and then it's an exciting treat. That's great if you can afford those sort of things. That's wonderful if you have a sense of like, well, I only want to knit this type of fiber, or, you know, I'm only going to ever use natural materials, or I only want hand dyes, or, you know, I'm gonna only support indie dyers, or like indie yarn stores or something like that, which is wonderful, and you should if you can do that. But I'm not a big fan of snobbery, because snobbery just shuts people out, and the knitting community isn't that snobby. It doesn't have a sort of, it doesn't have an exclusionary sense. I think that you can, from a lot of the things that are discussed and the way in which they're talked about, it can sometimes feel like, not that they're putting it on you, but you can start to feel, as someone who's learning all these things, like, oh no, I can never show up with like, you know, a project that's made out of acrylic or something at a knit. My thing is, I think that it's great to have self-snobbery, but I don't like the idea of like outward snobbery. You know, I have learned so much this past year, really almost like just this past 6 months, about yarns and about the processes that go into it and the way that the knitting industry works. And that's exciting, and I love it. And I think that for me, I'm gonna stop using acrylic, but I'm never gonna put that on someone else. The joy of the knitting world is that it is so inclusive, and it is just, you're held together by these stitches. This channel is my way of contributing to the knitting community. I'm not a designer, I'm not a yarn shop owner, I'm not a sheep farmer, I don't have a woolen mill, I'm not a spinner, I'm not a dyer. What I can contribute, I think, is this journey that I have been on, and the things that I've been learning, and that sense of wonder and joy. And I'm really excited to try to bring you along. That is my story. That is who I am. And I'm sure you'll learn a fair amount more about me over the course of these. But I just wanted to give you a quick primer so that any initial questions were answered. To say, hey, this is me, and this is where I'm starting, and we'll see where I go and where you go with me. So, happy knitting.